Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. With us today, we have Mr. Lance Mason. So everybody give him a welcome. Everybody's going to cheer for you and clap for you here. Really appreciate you. If the soundboard works, there we go. Cool. So for those of you who do not know, Lance was one of my rugby coaches when I played rugby in Santa Barbara a few years ago. So he and I go a few years back. But for everybody else, Lance, give us a little rundown of who you are and just a little bit of background.
I'll try to keep it brief. It's a little bit complicated because of my age. I grew up in a small farm town in California, about an hour north of Los Angeles, called Oxnard. It was in those days a fairly rough town. It had a reputation for illegal alcohol, prostitution, drugs, immigration. This is all going back pre-World War II and back in some ways to the 19th century.
I think it
so it was
still
an
has that
interesting
reputation.
Yeah, it does. So it was an interesting town to come from. I went to my first 2 years of university in Los Angeles at Loyola University, which is now Loyola Marymount. And my third year at UCSB, where I really had a fantastic exposure to rugby, and it really addicted me for the rest of my life. And then finished up at Loyola, and I did my graduate work as a dental surgeon at UCLA. And that began an interesting, long part of my life. Very fantastic career for me, extremely rewarding. I worked with, in school we ran a free clinic in Venice, and we worked on farm workers' kids out in San Joaquin Valley. My first year out, I worked for an American Indian clinic in Northern California. Then I went to New Zealand and taught at the dental school there. In the meantime, I taught part-time in a dental school in Brazil with an American charity. And played more rugby in New Zealand, came back and mixed mostly private practice for the next 30 years, but taught a fair bit as well at UCLA and ran courses in Santa Barbara for dentists for continuing education. Not courses I taught, but people I hired to come and run them. So that was, yes, rugby and dentistry were really the center focuses of my life. I began writing really in college, some poetry here and there, some bits and pieces, but more seriously in the latter years of my dental career. My first novel grew out of a very unusual, unique situation with some people I knew from Wales through the rugby community there who wanted to import California wine to Britain. They had a small European importation. So I got them a pallet of Zinfandel from about 20 different producers in California, sent it over there. U.S. dollar was too high to make it a regular thing. They paid me what we got. But I discovered a very interesting fact in doing the research on that through the Department of Commerce, which, by the way, was for many, many years the largest publisher in the United States. People want to know how America got to have so much influence commercially around the world. The Department of Commerce in America was the world's largest publisher of the printed word prior to digital stuff, and American industry used that research and those publications to develop markets around the world. But what I found out was that and I was involved in the wine business for quite a while here in California, in a small negociant business, that the third largest importer of American wine up until 1983 was Colombia, behind the UK and Canada, and that had to do with a long-standing Spanish heritage. Spain consumes a lot of wine and grows a lot of wine, and Chile and Argentina hadn't come into the market very much at that stage. So in '83 they came into the market. They negotiated a trade deal with Colombia that Colombia would only import South American wine for a period of time. So the plot of my first novel is based on that. Mm-hmm. It's based on cocaine smuggling, money laundering, the wine industry, and some technical stuff that goes on in the story. And that's called The Brass Ring, the title being related to an old mostly American phrase, the brass ring, referring to the reward that's out there if you reach out and grab, quote, the brass ring, which used to be part of a carnival carousel. You'd reach out and grab a ring out of a holder. They were mostly lead rings, but once in a while it was a brass ring, and if you got the brass ring, you got a free ride. And that's kind of been the impetus, if you will, the idiom.
That's interesting because I've read The Brass Ring a few years ago. So apologize if I don't remember every detail, but I always was curious what the title was. So thank you for clarifying that for me.
Yeah, there's a part in the novel where the sea captain, Wojtek Kudelka, by the way, is patterned on a sea captain that I sailed with from Antwerp, Belgium to Venezuela in 1976 on a Polish freighter. So that captain and the boat is patterned on that experience I had a couple of weeks crossing the Atlantic. So in there he talks about trying to exploit his leverage on this American smuggler. And he recounts his experience to himself of having visited Coney Island when he was a young sailor decades ago and seeing this carousel with the brass ring. And this is what America, in his view, this is what America promulgates throughout the world, and telling countries, oh, reach for the brass ring, work hard, you'll get a free ride, etc., when really people are out there just exploiting each other and taking advantage and so forth. That's where the title. Even to this day.
Don't think that's going to change.
Yeah. So I don't. You lead me in the direction that you think is going to be productive, but I will tell you a little more about things. I began growing a very strong interest in travel in my youth, in my probably adolescent and teenage years. It grew out of a few things. My mother was very involved in labor union politics and active in that, and took but also worked for the phone company, General Telephone, and so she took a group. She went with a group that was going on a European tour, and I was about 12 maybe. This was a very work level, blue collar sort of group, not a jet setting group. In fact, they took a prop plane over. That was in the last years of Scandinavian Air System. The Constellation, which was a 4-motor prop plane. And I was just fascinated to see this airplane at LAX and getting it and watching it take off. And then there was a movie called Around the World in 80 Days, and then people were starting to backpack, and a few people I knew were starting to travel a bit. And so I developed a real avid taste for travel. In fact,
it's interesting that you bring that up. I got a question about. So you sent me a couple works, a little for the audience. You sent me a couple short stories to read, and then I've read The Brass Ring as well. And it seems like all of these stories take place not in the United States. So tell me a little bit about what the allure is to you about writing about foreign places.
I've got a close friend here in Santa Barbara who was head of creative writing at UC Riverside and taught all over the world, but especially all over the United States, including UCSB in Pennsylvania and Kentucky, a lot of different places. And he's always leaning on me to make my stories that are fiction located in real places. And for me, the fiction brain goes to work when I'm working in a, so to speak, artificial or invented environment. So America, I hate to put it this way, it sounds kind of hokey, but it's too close to home. I find my brain, my adventurous brain, my sort of creative stuff goes on better if I kind of place it at a distance, so to speak. And that has a lot to do with my most recent novel, but we can talk about that.
So there's going to be a little bit of difficulty if you're trying to write something that you don't know, but other people do know. And I'm assuming you don't get too many angry letters when you get facts wrong. But do you think that you get facts wrong, or do you do so much research that everything is down to a T and you're very confident about it?
I like to think that I use, reliable research. Research was something I was involved in for a long, long time in my career as a dental surgeon and in running continuing education courses for dentists. So I think I do. I just did a major re-edit of the brass ring, and went back and did some more research on things. I updated it by 20 years or so. Did quite a bit of research there. The most recent novel I've written is called Palanquin. Palanquin it's an Asian word. It's used in a lot of different areas, not so much anymore, but was for a long time. It's a sedan chair, the box with the two runners and four people carrying the person around inside. It's an idiom for the British Empire, developing on the work of other laborers in other countries. And that novel is set mid 19th century India, and then transitions into Victorian London in the 1860s to 1880s. And the character is a battlefield surgeon with the British Army, a Parsi. It's a Zoroastrian. They're a small group. They used to be a very large group, but they've died out over the last 100 years or so. They were the people that populated Persia before the rise of Islam. And so he becomes a doctor and then gets recruited into the British Army by some friends and so forth. So yeah, there was a tremendous amount of research about the British wars that took place during that time that he serves in, about Victorian London, about the status and the evolution of lots of medical stuff during that time. This is the time when bacteria first were discovered, antibiotics first began, a lot of medical stuff that was developed during the 19th century in Britain and other places. There's even, in the longest version of the novel, I've got two versions, one's a bit shorter, he becomes involved with Sherlock Holmes and John Watson and helps Sherlock Holmes utilize fingerprinting, which had been used in South Asia for a long, long time to identify people, long before it was ever used in the West. So yeah, I do a lot of research on some of these things. One of the ones that I completed, and I haven't ever I haven't ever sold any of my novels, which must be some sort of a comment on the writing, but or perhaps on the thing you're observing about overseas bases for them. But one that is totally based in the United States is called Lone Star. An idiom, or a sort of play on words for Lone Star Beer, Lone Star Texas, but actually it's Loan, and it's about a young banker who gets caught up in a conspiracy between two mega bankers and a crooked congresswoman who are running a scam through Washington D.C. And bring him on board to write some legislation. So about finance and about it's partly green. It's about developing home generation electrical equipment for generation at home, and the green aspects of that and how they use that as a conspiracy, as a ploy to get the legislation passed, when really what's on their mind is very widespread international money laundering, and using the mortgages in the story that evolve in the story as their methodology for laundering money on the millions and billions scale internationally. And so there was a lot of research in that, yeah.
So going back to the brass ring and then the short stories that I've read, a lot of them seem to be drawn from real life events. Now, is this one that you just described also a real life event?
Yes. Well, the Palanquin. Well, for the Lone Star uses the crises of 2008 to 2011, the great financial crisis, or the global financial crisis as it's known, sort of. We call it the Great Recession, but most of the rest of the world refers to it as the GFC, global financial crisis. And the methodology that grew out of that in terms of mortgage abuse, this is like, okay, these guys are gonna regenerate that abuse, but on a different scale and a different avenue, if you will, which is these green home loans, federal guaranteed home loans, which is kind of a pivotal aspect of the novel because most of the loans that went bad in the global financial crisis were not federally guaranteed. But if you had that wide and that broad of a collapse, and those loans had been guaranteed by the federal government, by the U.S. taxpayer, we would have had a much, much more severe problem than we ended up with, even though as bad as it was. So in this story, that's the stakes. The stakes are extremely high because these guys are trying to pull the wool over, trying to pull a con job on the American taxpayer.
Yeah.
The stuff in Palanquin, a great deal of that is based on just factual history. The wars that Britain conducted in that part of the world during that time. There's even the main character has a love affair with Florence Nightingale. She became established during that period of time. She became established during the Crimean War in the 1850s. And in the story, the invented story, she has a love affair with my main character's best friend, best British Army mate, who later dies in the story, and by the time Arjani, the character, by the time he gets to Britain, he has to break the news to her and so forth. So she's a real character. Many of the people that I did research on are real characters, and they become characters in the novel. Nikolai Pirogov was a very, very established Russian surgeon, Moscow researcher and Russian surgeon. And when my character gets captured by the Russians in the Crimean War, he ends up working in field hospitals under this Russian surgeon who's a real person, Nikolai Pirogov. And many of the things that Pirogov pioneered in terms of battlefield surgeries, battlefield amputations, and orthopedic procedures of all sorts are still used today, or variations of them are used today. So yeah, taking people out of genuine history and adapting them into the stories is always an interesting thing to do, and it requires a certain amount of research.
Would you say that you are a historical fiction author then? Is that what your chosen genre is?
Crime and things to do with criminal behavior of one sort or another enter into almost all the stuff that I write. There is the story Palanquin, actually part of the backstory, the background of what's going on is there's been a series of murders of British soldiers in India, not wartime stuff, but actually, murdered purposefully. So there's a lot of stories, the history of what's been going on, but also in the background of it all is this murder mystery, which Arjani is also involved in and knows about, and his best friend was one of the victims of this murder, and then that theme follows him back to Britain, and part of the story is a climax of him and Florence Nightingale solving this murder mystery and who did it and how it happened and how they bring justice and so forth. So crime has a lot to do with the stuff, and how you can mix invented crime, fictionalized crime with real history, and is part of.
Well, I think a lot of history is motivated by, kind of as you mentioned at the beginning of our talk, like people doing mean things to each other. And so, crime falls into that. And so I guess there's always an interesting story when there's a conflict of one person wants something from somebody else. That is a very strong basis for conflict. So I guess you found something out there.
Yeah. Actually, I just received I get a newsletter a couple of times a week from a Canadian couple. Oh, actually, she's American, but he's Canadian. They live in Canada. For writers, it's a newsletter for writers, and they provide a lot of resources for where to look to get published and courses and so forth and so on. And one of the things I just came across in a newsletter was a group in Britain that are trying to start a serious scholarly journal on crime fiction, and one of the topics that they're asking for papers on now is gender, sex, and crime, the intersection of those things, and how you study those things and incorporate them, because indeed crime is always a disruption, a distortion, a perversion even of normality and what we expect as normality. And the disruption of normal associated with sex and gender is also something that's touches a lot of chords in the human condition. So crime, sex, and gender together have the potential to really stir up a lot of human appetite. So I'm just starting to think as of a couple of days ago about some stuff to possibly write as a paper for this journal.
Interesting. You gotta forward me that journal. I'm interested in checking it
Yeah,
out.
okay. I will, sure. It's no problem.
I do have a question though. I wanna discuss with you Palanquin versus Cooking Up Trouble. So
Okay.
at the beginning of Palanquin, we see a palanquin going down the street and then an attempted murder on somebody.
Yeah.
And so you kind of start this story. I forget what the exact term is in medias res, kind of like in the middle
Yeah,
of things. You
it's
start someone's
exactly
already
what it
been
is.
shot, and the surgeon comes out to save their life. And so I thought that was very interesting how you set that up. But then in Cooking Up Trouble, we have almost the opposite. We start ahead of the action, and then the main character is planning this assassination, and it gets to the end of it. And I'm not going to spoil what happens for those of you that are interested
sure.
in reading this. But what made you choose to start one of them with a murder and one of them well before this attempted murder?
We get in a little bit, and I don't want to drag this conversation into this direction fully, but part of what you're raising is the debate which some critics, reviewers, agents, editors want to call pantsers, P-A-N-T-S-E-R, people who write by the seat of their pants, meaning they do not outline their work ahead of time. Now, as it happens, I don't. And I was pleased to read Stephen King's wonderful book, in my view, on writing. And I'm not a big Stephen King proponent. I don't read all of his work, and I'm not a big fan of all of his work, but I am a very big fan of his writing methodology and his ability to teach that. And so his book on writing is about that, how he became a writer and how he writes. And he makes a very strong point of the fact that he does not outline his work. He starts off with a scene. Something visits him, some human behavior, some human interaction, some kind of a thing presents itself to his awareness one way or another. He's driving down the road and he sees something going on, and he takes that scene and puts it in his head and modifies it a little bit, or someone says something to him that sparks a thought, and so forth. He then populates the scene with characters that he says great stories aren't invented, they're discovered, they're uncovered, that you don't, right? And so he quote discovers characters to put into the scene. He fleshes them out. He gives them a backstory, and then he lets those characters behave the way human beings behave. And then the critics and editors like to call it pantsers. Well, you're flying by the seat of your pants. Well, I think that's like the typical human behavior where you find a belittling term for your enemy. The fact is that he and John Grisham's the same. There's a lot of very, very good fiction writers who write this way. It's a little bit baffling to people who don't write that way, and I write this way. So I didn't choose per se. The story of the Cooking Up Trouble, which the other title I had for it is A Hollywood Ending, grows out of my attachment to rugby. It sounds a bit strange, but one of my fellow founders of the club you played for was from Spain. He played in the centers. His name was Andres Martinez. And his brother came over for a year, Kike, and played number 10 for us for a year as well. And the youngest brother, Pablo, and I are still very close friends today. Kike died this past year, and Andreas died a number of years ago. He was an urchin diver and died diving. But Kike lives in Alcalá. That's how I came across the place where the story takes place, Alcalá de Henares, which is an eastern suburb of Madrid, and it was the birthplace of Miguel Cervantes. And Kike, my recently passed away friend, was a very, very good paella maker, and Andreas had a mobile paella unit here in Santa Barbara where he would be hired to go to parties and cook paella there, and a lot of different places. I had a fantastic experience in Spain at a small village called Batea that had a harvest festival in the autumn, and they had log sign contests and women with tug of war contests over mud pits and people drinking out of these glass things, hold it real far away and pour the wine into your mouth and all kinds of crazy stuff going on. And at the end, as the sort of the crisis of the whole day was a giant paella feast in the middle of town. They had 3 giant paella pans and cooked paella for the entire village and everybody who was visiting. So it has a real place in my heart. So I decided that I don't know. I came across some stuff about Cervantes, and I knew he'd come from Alcalá, and I visited there a lot of times. The part of the story about Belchite, the last place where the site of the last battle of the Spanish Civil War. It's a real place. It's never been restored. It was left in the condition it was left in when the war ended. So I chose that as the battle in which the main character's father is killed. So yeah, it grows out of a variety of things. I wanted to tell for Palanquin, the novel, I wanted to tell a story about Zoroastrians. They're a fascinating group. They're very small. I have a couple of friends that are Zoroastrians, elderly gents who kind of coached me through a lot of it. Timo Arjani and Kavaji Dadachanji. They're part of the Los Angeles Zoroastrian community. And I became interested in Zoroastrians when I was a teenager, reading about Marco Polo. He interacted with them quite a lot. They were important conduits on the Silk Road. I've always, there was a restaurant, a Zoroastrian or Parsi family that had a restaurant in New Zealand. I lived in New Zealand for 13 years and played rugby there and practiced there and taught there. So I've come across them in a variety of places. Some of the most successful business people coming out of India today are related to the Parsi heritage, which came into northwestern India in many centuries ago when Islam was rising and the Parsis were largely driven out of Persia, now Iran. So yeah,
I do have to say, you do have a mouth-watering description of the paella. It was very good.
Thank you.
I could almost taste it and I could see it. You had me there.
There's an aspect of it that was almost the title of the story called Sokarat, which is the kind of crusty but not dried out bottom layer of the paella as it's being cooked. Yeah. So.
Cool. Well, I do have another question about what's the other one called? The Train to Harare? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, the Train to Harare. And one of the things that you raise, I will reflect on a little bit. Having lived and traveled tremendously, but lived also in the former British Empire, in countries of the Commonwealth, and traveled there quite a lot, that also inspires a lot of my writing. I want to try to tell stories that Americans, and by the way, this reflects on your previous question, tell stories about places where Americans don't travel or don't know about or haven't seen or might have an interest in. That's a lot of the reasons why I choose the locations and the context of the stories a lot. So the Train to Harare is, as Matt will know, is an essay. It's not fiction. It's true to life, and a lot to do with Africa and the process of post-colonial independence in Africa. So go ahead. What would you?
Well, I was going to say, so you wrote it in the first person, and that's because it was legitimately an experience that you had fully?
Absolutely. That's completely nonfiction, that story, that essay. I went to Africa the first time in 1988 as I was leaving the United States to immigrate to New Zealand. And one of my college roommates, 2 of them ended up with long careers in the State Department. Danny joined a little later than Mike, and Danny was on his first posting in Gaborone, Botswana. in the embassy there, and I went to visit him. And my ongoing flight out of Africa to New Zealand, Australia, and then New Zealand, was leaving from Harare, former the what was once the capital of Southern Rhodesia, and is now the capital of Zimbabwe. So what this opening of the essay is about: a train ride from Gaborone to Francistown, and then on to Harare, and that's where I departed. So then that was in 1988, and then Mike Marine, the other fellow, these guys both grew up here in Santa Barbara, by the way, went to grade school here, high school here, were really good mates right through school and continuing through life. Both of them had fantastically, really interesting careers. They opened up avenues for me to travel around the world. Mike, his last posting was ambassador to Vietnam. He finished in 2008. After that, he was CEO of the Sabin Foundation, Joseph Sabin, who invented one of the early polio vaccines. And Mike worked with them for many years as a CEO, focused on health care for children in the third world, did a lot of work with the Gates Foundation. So going back, he was ambassador to Vietnam up till 2008. He was second in command, what's called DCM, or Deputy Chief of Mission, at the embassy in Beijing before that. He was Deputy Chief of Mission in Nairobi when Al-Qaeda bombed the embassy there. He was Consul General in Moscow before that. And he had several tours of duty in and around Africa. So I went back after the bombing. I was getting ready to immigrate from New Zealand back to the U.S. in '98. So I'd been there for 11 years. And Mike had been running, he was second in command of the embassy in Nairobi when the bombing took over. The woman who was the ambassador took an early retirement after the bombing. Mike took over, and I was concerned to see how things were going, and went through Nairobi at that time, a couple months after the bombing, and spent some time with Mike and Carmela there, and then traveled down overland to Danny, who was in Pretoria at the time, and then on been back to Africa a few times when Danny was at Cape Town and some other places. So had a lot of exposure to Africa over a number of years, and I thought that story was worth telling.
So I don't recall the exact wording of the last few words of that, but I feel like you said something like, I got on the plane and never looked back, or something like that. Is that correct? I can pull it up, actually.
Yeah, if you can, you might be. I didn't send you the one that took place in the Balkans, did I? Did I send you the one, the
No,
lessons
you
of
did
Dernich?
not.
Okay, yeah, okay, yeah.
So bear with me while I pull it up. But where I was going with that is you had mentioned that you went back a few times, but the sense that I got from the writing from this essay that you wrote was that you loved being in Africa, but it was almost like a love and then like a sadness, hate for what was going on. Is that kind of the vibe?
Yeah, yes. There's Richard Kopachinski, the Polish journalist that I mentioned in the story, has written a lot about Africa. Fergal Keane, a BBC correspondent, is a fantastic book called Blood River by Tim Butcher, a British journalist, about the Congo in more recent times and going back through the history of Congo and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I just find Africa an incredibly fascinating and complex place, and not an easy place to travel if you get off the beaten track. Hard for Westerners, in my opinion, to perceive and understand, grasp what has gone on there over the last several hundred years, and especially the last 100 years, and especially the last several decades. But it is part of the human condition, and I think Americans need to learn a whole lot more about the human condition of groups outside of America, especially in places that are under a lot of stress and strain and danger and risk, because we have a big role to play internationally.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, well, I really enjoyed talking about your works, but I do have a couple questions about specifically maybe like your writing habits. So
Sure.
tell me a little bit about that.
I can I tend to write more late in the day and into the night. I think that has to do with some aspect of my head that feels the outer world shutting down and leaving me alone, so to speak. And I think my creative impulses are stronger then, and a little bit wilder and a little bit less restrained, or less roped in, so to speak. Um, I don't type very well at all. These headphones have been around for a very long time. A close friend, a Kiwi friend of mine, who's in the tech world, one of the guys I referred to a little earlier about the tech world, he runs a business and has for several decades. He was be one of the first guys designing websites and hosting websites and setting them up for people. He put me on to voice recognition software about 12 or 13 years ago, maybe. Dragon, he was the first real people that came out with him. So I still use that. I tend to write longhand, and that's because I think my brain, my creative activity works more or less at the same speed at which I write longhand. So I tend to write longhand and then transcribe it verbally, and then edit it either verbally, because the programs do allow you to do that. So your voice command editing, or I'll get it printed out and do the editing by hand, and then basically translate that over to the manuscript by voice.
Well, who says you can't teach an old dog new tricks? Look at you. Come on.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, that's going to be encouraging for people who maybe, as yourself, are not great at typing, or maybe for those who could be visually impaired or something like that. If you have a story to tell, there's a way to tell it. So that's really encouraging to hear that.
Yep.
Tell me a little bit about getting your works to the public. You had made a comment earlier. I don't remember exactly what you said. Something like, "No one wants to buy my books," or something like that. But I do know that you're on Amazon, right? So tell me a little bit about self-publishing, or if you want to go the traditional publishing route.
Yeah, Amazon is a real two-edged sword. I don't have any of my books. The only book that's for sale on Amazon is a book of essays called A Proficiency in Billiards, which is a collection of 12 essays of places I've lived around the world and traveled, and it's kind of a travel essay. Several of those actually won awards for travel writing, and this is not travel writing like let's go have a vacation in Hawaii. This is travel writing about going into exploring places in the world and discovering things about people and activity and things like that I thought are interesting and valuable for people to know about. So that's what's on Amazon. There is a very strong bias in the traditional publishing world against self-publishing. There are people who do it and do it successfully, but they're a very, very small number. It's one thing to self-publish. It's a whole other thing to try and sell books that you've self-published, unless you are a real good, unless you know a lot about marketing and you want to devote your time to doing that instead of to writing. So I used what was called CreateSpace, and now it's KDP, I think, is a branch of, in order to produce beta reader copies. In other words, genuine paperback copies, but they're for like Matt Struven to write, your friends and people to read the book in a convenient way, instead of a 8.5 by 11 manuscript that they have to use clips, et cetera, et cetera. So I've used Amazon to do that, but none of those books are for sale, but on Amazon. However, I have been, I've been trying for a long, long time. I can't really answer the question, except that my writing must be crap. I don't know. I don't know why.
Having read some of your stuff, I don't think that's the problem.
I don't think
Maybe
it is.
It's too highbrow for everybody.
I don't know. It's a little bit confusing to me, but I've had no success convincing any agent or publisher to take any of the novels. One is out there at the Santa Monica Press at the moment. That is the only other historical one I've written, and that's 20th century historical. That's about growing up in Oxford, about two Anglo kids growing up in Oxford in the 60s, and during a time of very significant ferment in the world of ethnic strife, the end of the Bracero program, which was a federal program started in the 40s to bring Mexican labor into California, into the southwestern states, and then but not become residents. And in '63 they ended the Bracero program and opened up immigration to a lot of people, and that caused a lot of anxiety and stress and angst in the Southwest, in rural communities all over the Southwest, and Oxnard was no exception. So it's a story told through the eyes of one. It's told in the first person by one of the two boys, who has spent the last 30 years in prison for what happens at the crisis, the end of the book, so to speak. And so this, this press was looking for 20th century historical fiction, coming of age story, something preferably in the last half of the 20th century. So fingers crossed, someone over there might lay an egg here and tell me they want to publish the book. But I'm keen for anybody who listens to this podcast who can hook me up with an agent or an editor who's looking for the kind of work that I write.
Yeah, well, me too. So
I'll listen. There's a whole lot more.
All right, I got 2 questions to wrap it up. First, what impact do you want your writing to have on the world?
Thank you. I would like people's horizons to be expanded, and there are a lot of crime fiction readers, there are a lot of mystery readers, and maybe that's a large audience. And if I could get that large audience to be interested in other parts of the world, or other perspectives on the rest of the world that we don't see in most of our daily lives, I would really like that. I'd love people to come to me and say, wow, I didn't really know very much about this, but you've piqued my interest in what happened in India in the mid-19th century, or why we are still at risk to financial con artists and abusing the American mortgage market. Or I was fascinated to read about the post-colonial independence movement in Africa. Yeah, I would really like people to find that they found a wider horizon from something I wrote.
Awesome. My second and final question is not so much about your writing. Well, I've got so many questions for you, but on this podcast, not so much about your writing, but for example, what I know about you is, like, we chatted, maybe after games or over a beer or something like that, and I find out that you're going on 100-mile bike rides well into your 70s, going to New Zealand and doing stuff like that. So as I advance in age as well, what can I do to ensure that I have an exciting life?
Okay. I mean, this is going to sound a little bit strange to say this, but keep a strong interest in the lives of other people. They will open up doors to you and keep your interests in other things outside your life. Because if you say, how can I have an exciting life, part of that implication is that there are things out there to discover in life that currently are not part of your life. Do I kind of understand that from the question? Do I not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or how do you forge your own exciting life?
Yes. Well, what I'm driving at is that by incorporating other people in your life, they will give you diversity of interests and tastes and things like that, and you have a high probability of finding an excitement in those other areas that are currently not part of your life, but will become part of it.
Awesome. That is a great answer. Everybody, Lance Mason.